Hey, in this video, I'm going to give you some tips and tricks to avoid having straps breaking out of your bags. Imagine, if you will, this glorious little backpack being filled with bricks. That's right, bricks. All it takes is one client, one customer, to overstuff a bag and then email you and frantically ask for you to fix a strap on something that's practically impossible to fix without ripping it apart and just making it all over again. We've all been there. Well, at least if you haven't, you will be, but maybe not after watching my video, because I like to pass on the knowledge that I have gained over many, many years of making bags and messing up. Along your bag making adventures, you're going to run into one of three types of pre-made webbing that you can use as straps. This is a great economical option to quickly create a bag and not have to worry about making your own straps out of leather or vinyl or even cotton. Now, some of the tips I'm going to give in this video will apply to handmade straps, but the initial set of tips will apply to one of these three. You're going to have a seatbelt styled webbing, a more traditional style webbing. Both of these come in nylon and polyester. That does matter, and I'll go into that. And then you have a much more traditional styled webbing made of cotton. The seatbelt styled webbing is going to be thinner. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's not strong enough for strapping, but it is easier to sew when you have a bunch of layers for larger or more structured bags. The more traditional weave here for a poly or nylon webbing is going to be very thick and is good for like wristlet straps. The cotton webbing, pretty much along the same lines of the thickness and the heavy duty nature of the one in the center here. However, it's going to fray, which is something that both of them do to an extent, but the cotton's going to do a lot more naturally as it is a natural fiber. So how do you stop the fraying from happening? Well, there's a couple of different things that you need to do depending on if you're using natural cotton or a nylon or polyester webbing. If it's nylon or polyester, you need fire. Well, not a lot, just a little flame. For cotton, you actually just need to sew it. Let's start with the cotton webbing. So I'm at the sewing machine, clearly. I'm going to take some scissors and just delicately trim away a little bit of the portion that has frayed. You don't have to take all of it away, but get a little bit off of there just to make sure that you're actually going to be sewing in a spot that can be stabilized. So we're going to put it under the presser foot, and I'm holding my thread tails. This is my industrial, and I'm going to stitch a line down and back a few times that is around 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch. If you're using the a Juki DU1181N, that's a lot of numbers. If you're using an industrial, this typically I'll go like just a bit over this middle section here, and I'm going to start stitching. Go all the way to the edge and then go back, and if you want, you can go over it a third time. It really doesn't matter. This is a portion that is not going to be visible to the end user. It'll be tucked inside the seam allowance of the bag, but this will stop it from fraying. The other thing that you should do is take a little bit of fray check. It doesn't have to necessarily be this specific kind of glue, but it's a nice liquidy glue that you can put on woven materials to kind of help stop them from continuing to fray on you. It's awesome for finishing seams if you're too lazy to overlock like me. So we're just going to take the fray check and put it along the end here, just a little bit. Actually, I lied. I'm globbing it on there because I panic when bags break open. Just set this aside to dry, and we're gonna move on to show you what to do with the nylon or polyester webbings. I actually wasn't joking when I said to get fire and to use fire on nylon and polyester. The reason that you can do this with nylon and polyester is because it's going to very lightly melt those fibers down and do essentially what you were doing with the stitch here and the frayed check. You're just going to take a lighter. You don't even have to have this kind of lighter. but you need some kind of open flame. Just don't do this over a bonfire. Like, disclaimer, please don't sue me if you're stupid enough to stick this into an actual bonfire. But I just light this baby up and hold the ends and kind of move it back and forth to melt it down. And you'll know it's real good because it'll just like, it melts really well. So we'll do the same over here. And I do still recommend trimming these down a bit, making sure that you don't have things really like frayed out. The same thing applies to the heavy duty kind. You may just have to hold it a little longer because it's a little thicker. Yeah, that's what she said. Now, if you're not really coordinated, like me, and you feel a little more secure putting the flame somewhere else, you can light a candle. Who doesn't like candles? Bad people don't like candles. So those couple of tips there to start out work really well with pre-made webbing. The next set of tips that I'm going to give will apply to all strapping, even if it's handmade. I've drawn some helpful lines here so you can kind of follow along better as I'm stitching through. So this we're going to pretend is my 1/2 inch seam allowance. So in this 1/2 inch, that's what's expected of the pattern. And again, I'm going specifically with bag making here, where a lot of the patterns are either 3/8 of an inch or 1/2 inch for the seam allowance. If it isn't, then that's probably because it's a smaller bag. And you probably don't need to worry about any of this with a smaller bag, she said very aggressively and confidently. So we're gonna stick this up under the machine here and get this stitch going. And actually, just for consistency's sake, I am gonna use a clip here. Now, one thing you could do if you want, depending on how the bag is finished, is you could pull the strapping out just a little bit from, like maybe 1/4 inch out from the seam allowance. But if you are doing a bag with binding, then you don't want to do that because it's basically just going to get in the way of the binding. So I do put it pretty much right up against the edge and then clip it in place. So we're going to stitch that down. And I am, just for demonstration purposes, using a longer stitch length so you can see what I'm doing. And we'll stitch down the seam allowance. And then we'll end that stitch there. So right through here, you can see that I have absolutely captured my strapping. However, this is just one seam. If you really want to reinforce this, you need to do a second seam to kind of help counterbalance and load share any stress that this particular seam is going to get from being carried or tugged or lugged with lots of bricks, because God knows that's happened. So I tend to do another stitch just inside, right around an 1/8 to a 1/16 of an inch, somewhere in there, on the inside of the seam allowance. There we go. Now, you're probably wondering, why didn't you backstitch here and here? Because there are a lot of people who will do that. And it really just depends on your materials. Most of the time I am using vinyl, and I don't want to backstitch because that's more holes that I'm introducing to the work, and it could basically destabilize it and make it rip. The Hail Mary, of course, is to use rivets. I'm not going to demonstrate it because it's overkill. And in most situations, you're going to want to trim your seam allowance down, just, I guess, depending on the bag style. If you want to leave the seam allowance intact, that's a lot of seam allowance and it can introduce a lot of bulk, especially on curves. So apply rivets judiciously. For example, tote bags. Works great with the tote bags. You can extend as much of that strap down that you need and put a nice rivet right under it after you've finished the bag and you've put everything in place and all the bells and whistles are there. You can rivet it down if you really want to do it. That's a good place to do it. There are other bags that have lovely strap connectors and other widgets and overlays that you can use, and it makes sense to be able to place a rivet there. It just looks like added hardware. All right, if you take any advice from this video, let it be this. get heavy duty thread. If you're using a domestic sewing machine, you can buy upholstery thread at any big box store, bar none. That's what you should use. You should use it in the upper thread and in the bobbin when you're doing larger bags and trying to reinforce things like strapping. If you try to use a standard 40 weight thread, just a universal application thread, you're gonna have problems and you will absolutely do the Hail Mary rivet approach, which I've done so many times. Now, if you're like me and are using an industrial machine or even a semi-industrial machine, you need to get Tex thread. It needs to be weighted at least 80 or 90. Some people can go as low as 70. Tex is different in terms of how to gauge thread and its heavy dutiness, as opposed to weight, which you'll see on more domestic weighted threads. For the ones that I'm holding here, this is a Tex 70. And this one is a Tex 90. Both of these threads are perfectly acceptable for sewing handbags or any other heavy duty thing you might need, like a tarp to hide your husband's body. So now that I've potentially gotten myself banned from YouTube forever, feel free to like the video, subscribe to my Flippin' Flappin' channel, and leave your comments below. I want to hear from you. What are your techniques? I'm sure you all have some awesome ones. Let me know. See you later.